All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Stolt. This is Chris Payne. We're both with iDeliverable. And I didn't know this before, but apparently I'm famous. So I guess I don't need any further introduction. Chris, do you want to say a few words about who you are, where you're from, and all that?
Yeah, I'm from the UK. This is my third Orchard conference, I think. I've been working with Orchard for a number of years. Only recently just joined iDeliverable. Actually, it's been a year.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, been with iDeliverable for a year. So yeah, that's me.
All right.
Short but sweet.
The bulk of what we do, I guess, is Orchard consulting. And lately, there's been a fair number of consulting gigs where we've been asked to help companies improve the performance of their websites and kind of troubleshoot performance-related issues. And as you know, in doing that, a clear pattern starts to emerge soon enough, which is that most of the time, more often than not, it really comes down to the inability to output cache your content as aggressively or as flexibly as you would want to achieve optimum performance for your site. And so a while ago, Chris kind of came up with this idea that he thought could solve this problem once and for all. And since then, we've been kind of working together on building this out into an Orchard module that we call iDeliverable.donuts. The donuts name sort of refers to two common caching strategies that this module can help you achieve in your Orchard site, which is donut caching, where you can cache sort of the donut of your page, everything except some selected pieces, and donut hole caching, which is where you do the opposite. And those are two of the things that this module can help you configure in your Orchard site. And this module has come to completion, so we're launching it right here and now, I guess. So it's available now, and we'll get to where you can go and find it and stuff like that later on. So we thought it would be cool to show you guys what you can do with it. And to do that, we are going to just start with a fresh, vanilla, basic Orchard site, just set up straight out of, I think it's the 110x branch on the official repo, and just cooked off the default recipe. And then we're going to gradually, Chris and I are going to take turns and gradually just add some elements of content to the site. And in doing so, hopefully encounter some of these common performance pitfalls and show you how this module can help you to overcome them. So, but before we do that, Chris, do you want to run through a bit of the underpinnings and the architecture of the thing? Oh, by the way, I should have said, this is the agenda. This is some of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to phrase it all sort of in terms of the common problems that you might encounter, and then show you ways that you can use this module to sort of solve them. All right, Mr. Payne.
Okay, yeah. So the first problem that a lot of people will encounter is personalized content. And what I mean by personalized content is when you're displaying content to users that might have data that's specific to them. So a common one would be putting someone's username on the page. Now the problem with that is that if you output cache that output, the next user to come along is going to see the previous user's username, because the previous user's username has gone into the output cache, and then the next user comes along and will get that user. So more commonly, the way people would put usernames into the page is with tokens. So orchard.tokens comes out of the box. It's quite cool, it's quite powerful, but it kind of has this this flaw where some of the tokens can't be output cached very easily. So in this example, what we're seeing here is we've got a couple of tokens. One is the username and one is the current date time. And the way the tokens works is it'll actually resolve those tokens, put them into the markup, and then output cache that. Now that's a problem because when the next request comes in and asks for that from the output cache, that data is either going to be stale or it's just going to be flat out incorrect. And so we kind of put our heads together, and the way that we fix this is a concept that we call placeholders. So this is the architecture of placeholders. It differs slightly to tokens in the sense that you can put your placeholder into the text. So here we're just putting the username. And the key difference is it'll actually keep that token in place when it puts it into the output cache, which means that subsequent requests come into the output cache. the token's still in place and it can be resolved with the correct context. So with the same single output cache item, you can vary what actually gets sent out to the user based on these placeholders. So this is quite a core concept to the way that the entire module works, and we'll explain later what we mean by that.
Right, good. So, and to sort of illustrate this, let's go to our freshly cooked orchard site over here, and just go to the modules view, and just search for donuts. We've got two modules in here. One is the iDeliverable.donuts, which provides one feature as it is right now, donuts for content items. We call it that because we have more plans for more donuts features coming down the line. And then we've got this donuts demo module that we just created for this talk. And this one depends on that one, so I really just have to enable the demo one. Okay, good. So those things enabled. Now I'm going to go to the configuration page for the built-in default output cache that comes with Orchard out of the box. And I'm going to change a couple of things here. I'm going to tell it to ignore no cache headers. I'm going to tell it to cache authenticator requests and to vary by authentication state. This is not a prerequisite for using our modules by any means. It's just something that I do to make it easier to demo some of the things that we're going to demo in a few minutes to make sure that the page content refreshes as we want it to do. Okay, so I'm going to save that. All right, so now let's go and add a widget to our site. So I'm going to add just a simple HTML widget for now to the before content zone of the site. And in this HTML widget, I'm going to call it render times. I'm going to not render the title. And I'm going to paste in just some content into the body of that widget. So what I'm pasting in here is just to illustrate the difference between tokens and placeholders and kind of to help us see the rendering time of the page as we progress through the other demos. So you'll see here, you'll note the first one is just a standard token, as you will have seen them before. It's the user.name one. And then we've got this alternative syntax that we use for the concept of placeholder, which is a little bit different. Instead of using the hash, we use the double percentage so that those two sort of don't conflict with one another. Oh, you can't see? Sorry, should I zoom? Yeah. Is that better? Better? Cool. Token, placeholder. And then we're just putting in the token for the current time. So we can see that on every page. Just saving this one. So let's go back to the front end. And there we can see our little HTML widget. See, the token's been resolved, the placeholder's been resolved, and the current time it was rendered. So now this page has been put into output cache because that's the default configuration of Orchard. Now, what we can do, let's copy, save this URL, and let's open up an incognito window so that we can keep sort of different sessions, different login sessions. Oops, what happened there? And let's go back to the other one, and let's go into the admin and just add another user so that we can log in and out and sort of switch between these two users. So we'll call it other user at deliverable.com, and just set a password. And why don't we make it an admin? Okay, saved. So now let's switch over to our other site and sign in with that other user. There we go. So now this one shows correctly in both cases because I think the page was evicted. But if I go back to the original site now, to the front end there, and refresh that guy, okay, you'll see that the token has been cached in the output cache, but the placeholder resolves dynamically post-output cache in both cases, so it'll always resolve to the correct thing. And just to sort of prove that out, not that I don't think you trust me or anything, but let's go to the cache statistics, and we can see here that there is only one cache item in output cache for this page, even though it's being served with two different sort of markups. Okay, so now we've seen the fact that placeholders and tokens work differently. So let's see. Actually, we sort of resequenced things a bit here, didn't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we were going to, at this point, show you why they work the way they do, but I guess Chris already went through that. So do you want to talk a bit about the extensibility of placeholders as well?
Yeah, so the iDeliverable.donuts module has certain extensibility points, and placeholders is one of them. So you can create your own custom placeholders. If you grab data from an external API, like George was talking about earlier, you can create custom placeholders to put that data on the page. If your users have profiles, so if you've created a profile part and attached that to the user, you can also create placeholders to display that data. So the placeholders architecture is extremely extensible. You can just implement an interface. I think it's got one method and a couple of properties on it. And you can just extend it to your heart's content. So that's placeholders. So placeholders is the kind of core concept of how donuts work. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go through some more common problems. And we'll build on top of what we've already got, and we'll flesh out a site. And hopefully there's some problems that we're going to solve that you guys have all experienced yourselves. So the next problem on the agenda is the problem with volatile content. And for that, I'm going to hand back to Daniel.
All right, so this problem of volatile content is really, and what we mean by that is content that changes so frequently that you might not be able to output cache it as aggressively as you would like to for the, for pure performance purposes. So just to sort of illustrate that and to see how we can help fix it, we've built just a little sample widget we call the news widget that if Chris is going to go ahead and add to the site now, if you don't mind, Chris. I think it's on.
Okay, so like Daniel said, we've created a news widget. So this lives in our demo module. So the first thing to do is to add the widget to the page. And we'll add this to the aside second zone. Find the news widget. Let's call it the... Daniel's got a Swedish keyboard, so I've got to keep remembering to switch back.
It's actually not just a Swedish keyboard. I'm on Dvorak, and he's on QWERTY. So you're going to see if every time we switch, someone's going to type in garbage to begin with, and then we're going to correct it.
Okay, so we just put in a little bit of details that the API needs. So this widget contains a part, and that part goes off to an external API news feed that's just going to pull back the latest 10 sources or latest 10 news articles from a certain source. In this instance, we're going to pick Reddit. And fingers crossed, because there's been some bizarre articles come back once we've done this. Okay, so we've added that widget. I'm just going to go in and evict the output cache, and that's because we've already cached the home page and we've added a widget to it, and so we need to evict it. So I'm just going to click evict all on there. And I'm just going to refresh this page. And so we've got the latest news widget on the top here. So crucially, what we can see is the latest news tells us when it was rendered. So we can see this was rendered at 11:08 and 58 seconds, which is only slightly later than the actual page itself was rendered.
Right. So the assumption here then being that this news widget is something that updates and refreshes quite often, and we want users to see sort of the latest and greatest content of this widget. But on the rest of the page, you might have something else that is more, you might have stuff on the rest of the page that is very expensive to render. So you would want, like, for example, a very complex menu or some other widget or some other piece of content that you do want to output cache for a longer time, say like, I don't know, 5 minutes. But this widget, you really don't want to output cache for that long. Possibly you don't want to output cache it at all, because you want every user perhaps to just see always the latest headlines if it updates as frequently as several times a second. But with the built-in output cache feature of Orchard, you're kind of restricted to having the same cache policy applied to both of these. So whatever time that you're caching the overall page for, that's the time that the news widget is going to get cached as well. So you have to kind of you're forced to choose between sort of the lesser of two evils in this situation. And in this case, where we don't have anything else on the page, that might not be a huge deal. We can just go ahead and lower the output cache for the overall page, lower the duration. But in a real scenario, that might not be, a reasonable thing to do. So show us, Chris, if you don't mind, how we can overcome this with donuts.
Okay, sure. So just to illustrate what Daniel was talking about there is if I refresh this page, you'll notice that the time that this news widget was rendered isn't going to change. And that isn't going to change until the page itself drops out of output cache, so 5 minutes by default. So Donut ships with a content part called item level cache part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add that to the news widget. So if we just go news widget, add parts, find the item level cache part, and then save that. And then what this will do, this will give us some configuration options that allow us to specify a different cache policy for this news widget compared to the page. So if you remember, the page is cached for 5 minutes. We can actually go in and configure some settings here. So there's a handful of settings. I'm not going to explain what each one does right now because we'll get onto it at a later date. But for this example, we're just going to exclude this widget from the page cache. So if we go ahead and save that, I'll have to evict the output cache again, just the first time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to load this page. So that page there has been put into the output cache now. We can see that the page was rendered at 11:12:04, and we can see that the latest news widget was rendered at 11:12:05. Now, because I've chose to exclude this widget from the page cache, whenever I press refresh, this widget, the latest news widget, will re-render. And so if I keep hitting refresh, you can see that the time on the latest news widget is changing, but the time on that the page was rendered is static. And that's because that page is coming from the output cache, and this widget is being rendered on every request. So let's say that we've decided that rendering it on every request is a bit overkill. We don't really need to do that. So another option we can do is we can cache that widget independently of the page, and we can give it an entirely different cache policy to what the page has as a whole. So let's go back to our content definition for news widget, and we'll edit that. And then we'll go and choose to cache the item. Now, when I click cache item, I'm seeing a handful of extra options. Don't worry about those for now, we'll come back to them. But what I'm interested in here is saying, let's cache this widget for 5 seconds. So let's save that. And I need to evict again. And refresh this page. So you see the page was rendered at 11:13:32, and the widget is 11:13:32 again. If I keep pressing refresh, it's changed to 39. That won't change again until 44 seconds because we're caching it for 5 seconds. And so you can really get this granular level of cache configuration on your page. If you've got a particular widget that is expensive to render and rarely changes, you can cache it for a much longer duration than the page itself. And conversely, if you've got a volatile widget that changes frequently, you can drop that right down, which is quite cool, I think.
Right.
Yeah. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Daniel to kind of explain the pros and cons of the different cache durations.
Right. So we've seen two strategies for the widget so far. We've seen Chris started out by configuring to not be cached at all, so just exclude it from output cache, and then caching it for a much shorter duration than the rest of the page. And sort of the trade-off between those two is exactly how fresh do you want this widget to be for people versus how expensive is it to render it. And if it's a super cheap thing to render, then by all means maybe that's an appropriate choice to not cache it at all. But if it's at all expensive to render, which is probably the case here because we're calling out to an external API, and you still want it relatively fresh, then just setting a very, very small duration, like 1 or 2 seconds, can make a super big difference if you have a site under massive load or you have hundreds of users per second potentially. Then just those few seconds of cache might make all the difference between a running site and one that just crashes. And I guess it's worth explaining a bit at this point also what it is we've really done with this part. So you saw the concept of a placeholder illustrated earlier by Chris. And what we've really done with this part is to write a part that you attach to any content item that intercepts the rendering of that content item. So suppresses all of the default rendering of whatever item you attach it to, and instead inject into the markup a placeholder, like a super generic, super configurable, smart placeholder, if you will, which will contain within it the item of the ID that it replaces, and all of the cache settings that Chris showed you how to configure on the part. And then there's a handler for that placeholder that resolves it past the output cache. So at that point, the placeholder provider for that particular placeholder is going to go and see, okay, this is an item of ID this and that, with the cache settings of this and that. What am I going to do at this point? Can I find it already in output cache? If it's there, then just render it take it from the output cache, inject it into the markup of the page instead of the placeholder. And if it's not, then at this point, post output cache, go and render it and then put it in the cache. So it's really just a way of sort of deferring the rendering of an item to post output cache. And I guess we should mention also the storage situation. So the donuts module and the item level cache stores the rendered items in the same storage provider as the Orchard out-of-box output cache. So that's a reason we chose to do it that way, is because it's, well, one, it's easier to configure. You don't have to sort of keep track of two different storage models and two different storage configurations for the overall cache versus the item level cache. And the second one is, if you have custom storage providers, like there's a few built into Orchard, the Redis one, the in-memory one, the file system one. But if you've built a custom one for some other type of storage that you want to use, you can just plug donuts right into your site and enable it, and it'll use that same backing storage that's already there in your site, which is pretty convenient.
Yeah.
All right, so that was the problem with volatile content. Now let's move on to the problem with content that varies by state, Chris.
Okay, so what we mean by content that varies by state is, quite a good example might be a widget that a lot of sites might have in the header, a My Account widget. So if you were logged in, it would say welcome back, and it might have a little bit of user information in there. If you weren't logged in, you might be prompted to log in. You might have a username and password box. So iDeliverable.donuts comes with configuration that allows you to vary by content state. Daniel's going to demo that with a simple widget that or a simple shape that we've wrote that varies by authenticated state.
Okay, so in this demo module in here in Visual Studio, we've just created a very simple shape. We call it My Account. It's a shape template technically, I guess. All that it does is just get the current user from the work context and then just render different things depending on whether someone is logged in or not, just so we can see that it varies. So it'll either say you're not logged in or welcome back user. Very simple. So how do we get this into our site? So what we're going to use for that is a widget type called the layout widget, which is basically just a widget with a layout part that you can put any layout element into. And conveniently, there is a type of layout element called the shape element that just lets you render any arbitrary shape in your element, in your layout. So what I'm going to do first is go to content definition and find this layout widget in here. And then I will attach our part to it, item level cache, and save it. And so you attach the part on the content type level, but it doesn't mean that it does anything for all instances of that content type. So now I've attached it to the layout widget, but it doesn't mean that this part will do anything for all layout widgets that you might potentially create on your site. But because by default, it's configured with the option of doing nothing, which means let this content type render just the way it normally would, and let it be cached by the page level output cache just like it would without the module. And there's no performance impact or anything involved in just adding this part to any type. So now I've added it there. So by default here it's configured to do nothing on the content type level. So I think I saved it already, but just to be safe, let's save. So now I'll go and create a new instance of this widget type. I'll add that to the header section, why not? Make that a layout widget. Okay, I'll call it, well, my account. Ah, there's that Dvorak again. I won't render the title. So here's the layout part of this widget. So now I'm just going to take the shape element from down here, just drop that into our layout. And what this element lets you do is just specify an arbitrary shape name. And that shape will get sort of implicitly created, and it'll find a template for it, which I showed you a second ago. So my account, let's save that. And then if I come down here, because I've attached the item level cache part to the widget type, I can now see that by default, this particular widget is configured to inherit its cache settings from the type level. So there's actually two levels where you can control the cache policy, either on the type or on the individual item levels. And by default, it's just configured to inherit. So I'm going to uncheck that box and change this item to cache it for, let's say, a duration of, yeah, why not 5 minutes? Okay, and then I'm going to save it. And I'm going to go to the cache, output cache, and evict everything so we can kind of start fresh. There's nothing in there. And then go to the front end, reload. We can see here we've got welcome back user. And then what I want to introduce now at this point then is the problem of content which varies by state. So I've attached the item level cache part to this widget, but I haven't made it vary by any state. So what will happen now when I log out of the site, sign out, it's still going to say welcome back user. So how do we fix this?
Okay, so idleable.donuts has this concept of vary by. Now, if you've configured output cache yourself, you're going to be familiar with this. And if you were paying attention at the start, you would have noticed that Daniel configured the page itself to vary by authentication state. So idleable.donuts has this extensibility point that allows you to specify custom variations, if you like. So the one that we want to use for this is we want to vary by authentication state. Out of the box, Donut ships with 4 vary by options. Off the top of my head, they are vary by URL, vary by user, vary by auth state, and a 4th mystery one, which we'll see when it comes up on the screen. But you can create your own vary by providers, and it just plugs in nicely. And it's again, it's just a simple interface. I think it's a method and a couple of properties again. And you can, when you come to configure Donuts, it's just a simple opt-in or opt-out. So the reason why we need to do this is because we're caching this widget independently of the page. So even though we're already varying the page by auth state, we're not doing it for this widget. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Daniel, and he's going to request culture is the 4th one.
That's it.
Yeah. So he's going to vary by auth state on this widget, and we'll take a look and see how it affects the output of Donuts. Right.
So it's very simple. I'm back on the My Account widget in the item level cache part settings, and there's all these vary by checkboxes that Chris mentioned. So I'm just checking the one to vary by authentication state, then saving the widget. And then we'll see something interesting here that's provided by our module, actually. So we keep track of, for every widget, or actually not just widgets, but any content item, we keep track of which pages that they might occur on. And by default, Orchard is configured to evict all of the pages that a widget is on when you edit it. But for performance reasons, that might not always be what you want. So we intercept that process and give you an option to not do it. If you're okay with the fact that these pages might show a stale version of your widgets for another 5 minutes or so, then we don't force you to do it. So instead, we show you this banner when you've edited a widget that has the part attached to it, that there are some page level cache items that contain this widget, and we give you like a little link here that you can use to just go and evict them if you want, but you don't have to. So I'll click this. That says 3 cache items were removed. And now, if I go back out here and refresh, so it says welcome back user. I'll sign out. Now it says you're not logged in. So now, even though this widget is independently cached, it's configured to vary by authentication state. All right, so that was the problem with content that varies by state. Let's move on to the next one, which is the problem with rendering the same widget on many pages. And that's very common in Orchard. So let's assume, for example, that you have some kind of just a simple HTML widget, maybe in the footer of your site, and you have it configured to render basically on every page of your site. And normally the way that works in Orchard, even if you have output cache enabled, is that every time a user goes to a new page in the site that is not in output cache, the site gets rendered, and also all the widgets that are on that page. And for the most part, you would expect many widgets to actually be identical regardless of the page that they appear on. So what we're really seeing here is a lot of unnecessary work to render the same widget again and again for every page that it occurs on, which lowers the performance of your site. So show us how we can work around that, Chris, if you will.
Okay, so for this, we're going to switch back to the news widget. And for this demo, I'm actually going to bump up the cache time to a slightly longer period. So as Daniel pointed out before, we previously defined the cache settings on the content definition level for the news widget. So I need to explicitly choose to not inherit cache settings. And I'm going to go ahead and change that to 900 seconds. So if I go ahead and save that, we get the same banner, and let's just evict those items. So now if I switch back to the front screen, we'll just see what we saw before, but now instead of this widget being cached for 5 seconds, it's now cached for 15 minutes. And so let's add a second page to our site. So we'll call this page 2. No, we won't. We've rehearsed this 3 times, and every time this happens. We'll call it page 2. And we don't really need much on it, but what we do want to do is we'll show it on the menu. So we'll show it on the main menu, and we'll call it page 2 in the menu. We'll publish that page. I'll just jump in and evict the page level cache, or else my menu changes won't show on the front end. And I'll go and load that. So we can see that this page was rendered at 11:28:12. And the news widget was also rendered at 11:28:12. And so if I navigate to the second page, we can see that the news widget was still rendered at 11:28:12. So what we're seeing here is the same instance of the news widget. But we can see that the page was rendered at 11:28:24. So the page and the widget was rendered at different times. Yeah, and I think that's it.
That drives them.
Yeah, that's about as simple as that demo gets.
All right, so let's talk about the next problem of nested content items and different display types that we also want to show a bit about. So let's go back to the slides for that, because we have some diagrams to show this.
So when we talk about nested content items, what we actually mean is items that are usually displayed as a different display type as detail. So you might have a projection widget that displays the latest blog posts, and they might be displayed as summary display type. You might have a search page that allows you to search for blog posts, and they too might be displayed as summary display type. Or you could leave the norm entirely and create your own custom display types. But all this content is what we refer to as nested content. So in this slide here, we have a projection widget, and this contains 3 blog posts. So this is our latest blogs projection widget. So what you can do is you can configure this projection widget to cache for a relatively short period. So let's say if we cache this widget for a duration of just 1 minute. And then within that, we can actually define different cache settings, not based just on content type, content item, but also on display type. And that's quite a key concept for this. Because what we can do here is we can actually cache these 3 blog posts as summary display type independently and with a longer cache duration. So in this example, we cache for 24 hours. And within that blog post summary, you might also have a placeholder text, so you might have the current user's username in there, or the current date time in there, and that placeholder lives within that blog post summary. So if you remember what we said before, that all the cache items themselves are just placeholders. So what we've effectively got here is nested placeholders. So the placeholders are recursive, and they go down and they'll keep resolving until there's nothing left to resolve. So where this really gets quite cool is the fact that because we've cached the blog post in summary display type in the projection widget, if we also had a search page that showed blog posts as summary display type in the search results, we can actually use the same cache item on different pages. So there's no need to render that cache item again on the search results. What's also quite cool is because we've managed to cache the projection widget for a minute, if Daniel were to publish a new blog post now, historically we'd have to wait quite a while for the cache items to drop out. But now we only need to wait for a minute because the projection widget updates every minute. But crucially, the 3 blog posts in there, they're cached for 24 hours. So when a new blog post does get published, all we have to do is render the new blog post, and the 3 ones that are already published and already cached, they'll just bump down the pecking order. We don't have to re-render them again. That's also quite effective for search results. So you can cache each individual search result blog post displayed as summary independently. And if people vary their queries or there's new blog posts published, they'll still get the same cache items, but the search controller will just reorder them.
Versus with the built-in applicache, where every individual search query will just re-render the whole thing, including all of the summary items in that search result.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And you also get the added advantage there of reuse, as we said. Right. So if someone searched for a blog post that's come up in search results, you can cache that for a relatively long period, and then that can get reused across the site. So for example, projection widget.
Okay, so to show how we would set this up, I'm not going to set up a whole blog or create any blog post or anything. I'm just going to show you in the UI where we would go to configure this. So the blogs module is enabled by default, so I can just go to content definition, go to blog post, edit that. And let's attach our item level cache part to the blog post type and save it. And then what we haven't, you may have seen it, I think it's a little sort of pale on the projector. I don't know if you can see that there's actually a tab up here around the detail. I couldn't, but there is anyway. And then there's a little plus tab here. So what happens out of box when you attach this part to a type is that it includes by default a cache policy for the detail display type. But you can go ahead and add as many display types here as you want and configure the cache policy for this type individually per display mode. So what we'll do in this case is press the plus, type in summary, and hit save. And then if we expand this again, we can see that we now have 2 tabs, one for detail, one for summary. So you might leave the detail one alone and just let that be cached as part of the overall page cache. But for summary, cache these items for, I don't know, whatever 24 hours translates to into seconds. I can't do the math, but a long, long time anyway. And that's how you would configure this for the scenario that Chris just mentioned. And that would, if you have lots and lots of content on your site, like we came across a case where they had like tens of thousands of blog posts, and users, actually editors going in and adding new blog posts every, I don't know, there was several times a minute anyway. And every time that happened, the whole set of searches and projections that would display these blog posts on the site would have to re-render from scratch, and it was a huge problem. And this would just sort of, with a click, solve that problem altogether. All right, so that's the problem of nested content and different display types. Now, the next one we want to talk about is the problem with first-time rendering. And this is kind of a tricky one for me to explain because I personally don't really think that this adds much value, and I don't really see this problem. We've been kind of back and forth on this. But we do get asked for this a lot, and it is the wish to have content pre-rendered. So imagine that you have one of these blog posts and you go in and edit them. So normally that would just evict it from the cache, and then the next person to come around and request that blog post, they would just cause it to be rendered. And if it's expensive to render, that user would have to wait for that process to complete. So what we get asked a lot is there some way that we can just pre-render things as they are evicted and just make sure that they pop into output cache and they're ready there for the next user that comes along and requests them? So we did add that to the module. You can do that. And I guess you're better off showing this.
So the problem with pre-rendering a page in its entirety is that you pretty much need the request context. So you need to know if someone's logged in. If they're not logged in, you need to know who is making the request. There's all sorts of variables at play that make it very, very difficult to pre-render a page in its whole. And so what we've done is we've added the ability to pre-render the smaller blocks of the page, and so the nested content items or the widgets on that page that might get displayed. So to demo that, what we're going to do is we're going to switch back to the news widget that we saw earlier. And we should be able to see, next news, we should be able to see the cache items, the items that are already in the cache for this content item. And so if we go to the bottom, we can see that this cache item was created 8 minutes ago. And we also have options to evict all evict individual items, or we can also go in and actually view what's in the cache. So you can see the markup that's in the cache from within there. There's also a little bit of metadata in there about when it was generated. So we can see this was cached on 11/28, which was 9 minutes ago now. So what I'm going to do is, let's say that we're fed up with Reddit and we want to get news from the BBC. So let's just, nope. Let's just change that to BBC News.
Why don't you just switch to Dvorak already?
In Swedish as well. Okay, and then one option we've got here is to pre-render the new version. So I'm going to go ahead and tick that. It's worth pointing out that when we tick that, we actually lose the vary by options. And that's because if we were to allow the vary by, we'd introduce a whole new layer of complexity, which is effectively the initial problem with the pre-rendering the page to start with.
It's not just complexity, right? It's impossible, because some of those things that you want to vary by are known in the context of a request, but not in the context of a pre-render.
Right. Yeah. And so what I'm going to do there is, if I just save this, the second I save this, Donuts will pre-render the new version and put that into cache. So it will not remove the new version. Sorry, it will not remove the old version. It will just replace. So there's effectively no period in time where that cache item does not exist in cache. So let's go ahead and save that. And then if I go back into the latest news widget and scroll down, and we can see that that item was cached a moment ago. And so if I switch to the front end there, we've had some sort of API failure. But that has pre-rendered. We've probably just had an API failure. But yeah, I mean, you can see that the new cache item is in there a moment ago. And so that's pre-rendering. Daniel doesn't like it. I think it's useful.
I just think it's useful for that one user that comes along and requests this item.
But if that one user requests something that's expensive to render, why not?
Yeah, but it's just for that one guy. And for the most part, you couldn't use it anyway because you can't vary by anything. And well, people like it; they can use it.
Okay, so that was the problem with first-time rendering. We're going to move on to the final problem that we're going to try and solve today. I don't know if you were paying attention before, but we talked about the problem with rendering the same widget on many pages. Or we're going to talk about the other problem of rendering the same widget on many pages. And so I don't know if anyone's ever had this problem, but let's say if you had an HTML widget in the footer across every page on the site, or you have a navigation menu in the header of every site. Sebastian's shaking his head. Nobody has that. I know that's not true. So the problem with that is that, especially if you have hundreds or even thousands or even tens of thousands of pages on your site, Orchard's output cache out of the box, if you change a widget that appears on a page that's an output cache, it will evict that page. And so if you have an HTML widget on 17,000 news article pages and you go in and change the text of the widget at the bottom, you're going to evict every single one of those 17,000 pages. And if your site's under load when that happens, dead, dies. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use, we're going to illustrate the problem first, and then we're going to use donuts to show how it can be alleviated.
I actually don't have like a prep to actually use donuts to solve it, but I guess we could do that if we have time.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the render times widget that we added to the page before, that we didn't enable for item level caching, so it's just being cached as part of the overall page. So I've evicted everything from cache at this point. So let me just go back to the home page, render that thing. We can see that it was rendered at 11:41:39. Let's just wait a few seconds so we can see a difference. Go to page 2. You can see that it was rendered 41:47. Okay, so now let's go in and check the cache statistics. And we can see that there's a cache item here for the first page and one for the second page. And we can also see actually the item level cache items that our module puts into the output cache storage. They're visible here in the cache statistics as well. And they're subject to the same evict all action if you want to just evict everything. And this is because we're using the same storage as I mentioned before. So now what happens if we go to this widget, the render times widget, and just resave it. I don't even have to make any change to it, I guess. And then go back to cache statistics. Now that we can see that both of those pages are gone from the cache. So in this case, this would not be a huge problem, but if you had, hundreds of pages on your site and a lot of user load, then this could effectively bring down your site, which is why we intercept this from happening and sort of lets you be more explicit about when and how you want to evict things that contains these widgets.
Yeah.
Was that all the problems that we were going to encounter?
Yeah, that was all the problems.
Okay, so I guess then we're nearing a close. So as I mentioned, we're releasing this stuff as a new commercial module sort of today. It's called deliverable.donuts. You can go and find it on our website, and it has an unlimited free trial for local use, just as all of our commercial modules do. So, which means you can download it, add it to your site locally, use it there, try it out, completely unlimited for as long as you want. And as long as you're just on your local dev box, then the license checks will be bypassed. And because you're all nice enough to come here and listen to us talk about it, we are going to be offering just a 50% discount on this module for everyone that's here. We're going to send out that in an email if Sebastian is kind enough to give us all the addresses, which I'm sure you will. Right? Excuse me? That's perfect. All right, I guess that's it. Any questions on what we've talked about? Yeah, please.
Getting back to the original tokens thing, it seems like a bug. Was there an issue ever entered, or was there any discussion about changing behavior so that it would invalidate instead of caching?
Okay, so the question was the original problem with tokens.
Is there an actual use case for caching the wrong and serving up the wrong version of the page because of the tokens? Or is that a bug?
Yeah, I can answer that. We were actually expecting a slightly different question, but the answer's the same. We were expecting someone to ask, why don't we just resolve the tokens after the output cache? There's two very good reasons for that. Firstly, you don't always want to do that. Tokens, there's tokens for things like content item ID, content item title. You don't need to vary that. You can resolve that before output cache. The other reason is because tokens are sensitive to a context. They require a context. So the example that I gave there, so the content item ID, you need to know the content item that's currently being rendered. And so if you try to do that after the output cache, after the fact, you don't have that context anymore, and you can't resolve the tokens like that.
And that's why you're not going to be able to write placeholders for nearly as much stuff as there are tokens in Orchard, because you just won't have access to that context. We do ship that one placeholder for username out of the box.
There's a handful of placeholders out of the box. I can't remember exactly what they are, but there is a handful. Conversely, you could argue that you could write more placeholders because you can cache them, and they'd be a bit more useful.
Yeah, you can use more of them anyway.
Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it definitely answers the question about why you chose to create a placeholder. But it still seems like there is a bug in tokens that should be resolved in Framework, right? If I were using a token for something that shouldn't be cached, then I end up serving up, say, a page that has a long username on it or something like that.
I think you've just got to be careful. I'm trying to get eye contact with Sebastian, who's now just staring at me blankly.
Also, it'd be nice if this were just the default cache of Orchard. Forgot.
If it was what, sorry?
Somehow made its way into Orchard.
We'll take that as a compliment.
We talked about he knows better because he knows both his cache and Orchard 2's cache. I don't know his cache as well as he knows Orchard 2's cache.
Well, what if you used Orchard Cache to pay for this license? That was a joke. I'm just saying, I'm wondering why. We could all take up a fund to incorporate this into the core.
Sure, that's something we could discuss.
Talk about Chrissy's question. Tokens can be dynamic and context-based. Razor code can be dynamic and context-based. So in this case, in both cases, you don't want to cache it. If you don't vary by the context, your tokens and Razor code vary by.
So all you have to do is set vary by appropriately.
Yes, well, and you have to include the token in the vary by, actually. The token value should be in the vary by, because you can vary by content in there. You say vary by anything. There should be a vary by anything. I can put some code, tokens, whatever, and the value will change with every context.
Yeah, there are plans to make the built-in output cache more extensible in Orchard. We have some issues open for that on GitHub, where we've discussed sort of a provider-based model where anything could jack into the output cache model and add sort of variance to it. And I guess tokens could be one of those things, potentially.
And Taylor will tell you that in MVC core, there is a cache tag helper. And this cache tag helper has a vary by any Razor expression, which means if it's not supported by default, you just render the value that will vary in every request. And it will get two different keys because the value will be injected into the key. So if your token is part of the content and you want to vary by the token, you can inject the token into vary by anything. So the value of the token is part of the key. So you get as many keys as you have token values.
Right. Any other questions?
Orchard compatibility?
Oh, so this module, just like the question was about which versions of Orchard is this compatible with. So we tested on everything that is on the, so let's say, how is it now? Every revision on the current minor Orchard release, so that would be 1.10.x now. So we test and support all of our modules on every version, 1.10.anything basically. It might work on dev also in some instances. It might work on older versions too, but that's the one that we guarantee and that we support. So anything 1.10.*.
I've managed to get it working for clients against 1.9.3. It took a couple of binding redirects, and I had to change Orchard's lazy field because the definition of the signature of that has changed in Orchard 1.10 against 1.9. I think that was the only changes I need.
So it does work in 1.9?
Yes, we've done it for a client 1.9. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the price of the module, and what's the licensing restrictions, i.e. is it per domain or is it a one-off cost for unlimited sites?
It depends on what license you want. We offer a handful of licenses.
Okay.
So with all iDeliverable commercial modules, you can either pay a one-off fee and it's yours, or you can subscribe on a monthly or annual basis. We limit the license to one production host name, and I think 4 pre-production host names. So if you have dev, QA, and stage, that's included within your license, but you can only use it on one production host name. We do have licenses for unlimited host names, but it's kind of more of a ask us and we'll.
How about subdomains, like with multi-tenancy and things like that?
Yeah, so the production host name includes www. And then also no subdomain, so www.example.com or just example.com,
Yeah.
and that's it. You can't do subdomains.
Beyond that, but
yeah.
those two are equivalent in our licensing module.
Yeah. So you would require a license if you wanted it on multiple subdomains.
So did you mention that we allow you to specify to 3 host names, 3 unique host names when you buy the license?
Yeah, the pre-production.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So the price is for a one-off for a perpetual license, which includes all the future upgrades and unlimited support, is 690 euros, and then you can choose to do that or either.
345 if you're attendant.
Correct. Yeah.
That's quick, wasn't it?
Yeah. Very good.
You get 75% off if there are 2 of us here.
We can work something out. All right. Anything else? Okay, then. Thanks very much for listening.